At my granddaughter's graduation party, my son-in-law held up the quilt. I'd hand-stitched over 7 months. Looked at it, the way you'd look at something you'd found on the side of the road, and set it down on the gift table with a little laugh. "Very rustic," he said, tilting his head at the camera his sister was holding. "We're more of a minimalist household." The room did that thing rooms do, that awful ripple of polite laughter that isn't really laughter at all. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I picked up my quilt, folded it the way I've folded fabric my whole life, tucked it under my arm, and I left the party 2 hours early without making a scene. That night, my daughter called, and she was crying so hard she could barely get the words out. "Mom," she said, "please tell me you still have the quilt." And I said, "It's right here on the kitchen table, love, it's safe." And she said, "Mom, does he know what you put inside it?" I sat down. I put my hand flat on the quilt, and I said very gently, "Why do you ask?" "Because I just told him. And he's gone very quiet, Mom. He's been sitting in the garage for an hour." Here's what my son-in-law called Rustic in front of 40 people and a running camera. And here's what happened when the whole family found out what he'd almost thrown away. Welcome to Bold Mom Stories, where the thing they call outdated is usually the only thing in the room made with any love at all. Stay with me to the end. My name is Lorraine. And before you ask, no, it was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a lesson that took 7 months of my hands and 32 years of my late mother's patience to deliver. I'm 64 years old. I live in Fredericton, New Brunswick, in the same house my husband and I bought in 1987, the one with the apple tree in the back that still blooms every May, whether I remember to tend it or not. My husband passed 6 years ago. His name was Gerald, and he was the kind of man who fixed things quietly, who showed up without being asked, who never once in 31 years forgot our anniversary, not even the year he had pneumonia. I still talk to him sometimes, mostly in the garden. He was a good listener, Gerald, still is. What I haven't told most people is that Gerald was not the only one in this family who planned ahead. My mother was. Her name was Alice. She died 3 years ago at 89, sharp as a tack to the end, still doing the crossword in pen, still correcting my grammar, still folding napkins into swans at Christmas dinner because she said it gave the grandchildren something to look at. My mother was a quilter, not a hobbyist. A quilter the way some people are musicians. It was how she thought, how she organized the world, how she showed love. She could look at a pile of fabric scraps and see a story in them. She spent 60 years turning worn-out things into something that lasted. When she died, she left me 2 things I didn't expect. The first was her sewing basket, the old wicker one, with the green lining she'd had since before I was born, every needle in its place, every spool of thread arranged by color, the way she arranged everything, with quiet intention. The second was an envelope she'd tucked into the bottom of the basket, under the thread, under a square of batting, underneath everything. She'd written on the outside in her careful cursive, "For Clara, for the day she needs it most." Clara is my daughter, my only child. She was 31 when my mother died, and she'd adored her grandmother the way some grandchildren do. Fiercely, as though they'd recognized each other from some other life. My mother used to say Clara had her grandmother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and she said it like both were compliments. I put the envelope away. I didn't open it. My mother had been clear about who it was for, and Clara was in the middle of her 2nd year of a PhD program, and I didn't want to add weight to her plate. I told myself I'd give it to her at the right moment. I didn't know yet what that moment would look like. It turned out the moment would look like a quilt. About a year before Clara's graduation, I started making her one. I want to be careful here about what I say and how I say it, because I don't want to make this sound like it was simple or sentimental in the easy way. It wasn't. My hands are not what they were. I have the beginning of arthritis in my right hand, the same hand that has threaded needles and tied knots for 40 years, and some mornings I wake up and my fingers are stiff and reluctant, like they'd rather stay curled in a fist. I take it slowly now. A little in the evening, a little more on weekends. I've learned to be patient with my hands the way my mother was patient with everything. I chose the fabrics carefully. Some were new, some were not. a square of the blouse my mother was wearing the day Clara was born. She'd come straight from her garden club, hadn't even changed, and there's a photograph of her holding that newborn baby in her pale yellow blouse with the tiny blue flowers, beaming like she'd personally arranged the whole thing. A square of the curtain fabric from Clara's childhood bedroom, the one she'd chosen herself at 10 years old, pale green with small white dots, very practical, very Clara. A piece of Gerald's old flannel shirt, the red plaid one he wore every Saturday morning for 20 years, until the elbows gave out, and even he admitted it was done. And a piece of the dress Clara wore to her first day of university. She'd been so nervous, so quietly terrified, and she'd looked so grown up in that blue linen dress that I'd had to excuse myself to the bathroom afterward to cry. I didn't tell Clara I was making it. I didn't tell anyone except my neighbor, a woman named Frances, who's been bringing me soup when I'm under the weather for going on 15 years, and who can keep a secret like a bank vault. Frances knew, because she found me crying over the quilt one October evening when she stopped by unannounced, and because Frances is the kind of person who sits down when she finds you crying and doesn't ask you to explain yourself immediately. About 2 months into the quilt, I remembered my mother's envelope. I went and got it from where I'd been keeping it, in my own wicker sewing basket, where it felt right. I made a pot of tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Gerald and I had sat for 30 years, and I opened it. I won't tell you everything it said. Some of it is only for Clara. But what I can tell you is that my mother, Practical Alice, who corrected grammar and folded napkin swans, had been saving for her granddaughter for 30 years. Government of Canada savings bonds, the old kind, bought a few at a time through a broker she'd trusted since the 1970s. Every year, Christmas bonuses from the school board, where she'd worked as an administrative secretary for 27 years. Birthday money, she'd told us, she was spending on herself. Every good month, every unexpected windfall, quietly, patiently, in Clara's name. The envelope also contained a note in my mother's handwriting just for me. It said, "Lorraine, these have all matured. I've kept track. Take them to the credit union and they'll tell you what they're worth." I always meant to give them to Clara directly, but I think she'll understand them better coming through you. Put them somewhere she'll have to look for them. Make her work for it a little. You know how she is. She only appreciates what she's earned. All my love, Mum. I went to the credit union the next week. The woman at the counter was very kind and very patient with me as I spread 30 years of savings bonds across her desk one by one. When she told me the total, I had to ask her to write it down because I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. $43,482. 30 years of Christmas bonuses and birthday money and quiet little deposits, all come due, all sitting there, waiting for a granddaughter who didn't know they existed. I drove home. I made another pot of tea. I held the note my mother had written, and I thought about what she'd said. Put them somewhere she'll have to look for them. I thought about the quilt on my sewing table. I thought about my mother's hands, how she'd always worked meaning into things, how she'd never just given a gift, she'd constructed one. And I thought, she always did love a bit of theater, my mother. So I finished the quilt. And when it was done, 7 months of evenings and weekend mornings, every fabric square placed with intention, Gerald's flannel and Clara's school curtains, and my mother's yellow blouse all stitched together into something that would last. I did the thing my mother had asked. I took a seam ripper to a section of the backing along the bottom edge. I sewed a flat interior pocket, invisible from the outside, the kind I'd learned from my mother who'd learned it from hers. Into that pocket I placed the savings bonds, all of them, bundled carefully, and the letter. A letter my mother had written to Clara herself, sealed in a white envelope with "Open when you're ready" written on the front in that careful cursive. I stitched the pocket closed, neat, invisible. $43,000 and a dead woman's love, sewn into something a young man would call rustic at a party in front of 40 people. I should tell you about my son-in-law because I don't want him to be a cartoon either. His name is Brett. He grew up in Calgary, the youngest of 3 boys in a family where success was measured in square footage and the right postal code. His father sold commercial real estate and did well at it, and raised 3 sons who understood early that the best version of anything was the most expensive version, and that anything which couldn't be immediately valued was probably not worth keeping. Brett is not a bad man. He works hard. He genuinely loves Clara. I believe that, in the way he knows how to love, actively, loudly, with grand gestures, and booked restaurants and very expensive running shoes. He once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm because Clara mentioned offhandedly that she was having a hard week. That is not nothing. I have never doubted that he loves her. What I have doubted, from the beginning, is whether he knows how to love quietly. Whether he can value a thing that doesn't announce its value. Whether he has ever been in a room with something genuinely precious that didn't come with a receipt. Brett looks at me the way people look at antique furniture they've inherited, with a kind of tolerant respect, as if I am probably fine as long as no one expects him to sit on me. He is always courteous. He opens doors. He calls me by my first name, which I prefer, though he says it with a slight formality, as though we're colleagues. He has never once been unkind to me directly. What he has been is dismissive, not cruelly. The way a person is dismissive when they've genuinely never considered that the thing they're dismissing might matter. Clara finished her PhD in the spring. 7 years of work, 7 years of early mornings and grant applications, and a dissertation I only half understood but was extraordinarily proud of. The graduation itself was in May, and her partner's family, his mother, his sister Renata, his brother-in-law, came from Calgary for it. Clara's closest friends were there. My neighbor Frances was there. There were 40-some people in all at the dinner party. Brett's mother had organized at a restaurant in downtown Fredericton, and it was lovely, genuinely lovely, white tablecloths and good wine, and a 3-course meal and a little speech from Brett that made Clara cry happy tears. The gifts were opened after dessert. I had wrapped the quilt in brown paper, the good heavy kind, tied with a length of forest green ribbon. No box, no tissue. Just honest paper and an honest ribbon, and the most carefully made thing I have produced in my 64 years. My mother's hands were in it. Gerald's flannel was in it. $43,000, and a woman's last words to her granddaughter were sewn into the lining, and I had spent 7 months getting it exactly right. Brett's mother handed Clara gifts one at a time, and Clara opened them at the table. A beautiful silk scarf from her Calgary in-laws, a gift card, champagne glasses from her university friends, and then the brown paper parcel. Clara looked at the tag, looked at me across the table, and smiled. And it was her real smile, the one that goes all the way up. She started to unwrap it carefully, the way she's always unwrapped things, saving the paper, and Brett leaned over from beside her and peeled back the brown paper in one pull, the way he does everything efficiently, without fuss. The quilt came free. For one moment, the table went quiet, because even in a restaurant, even under fluorescent adjacent lighting, the quilt was beautiful. 7 months of intention, every square placed just so, the colors moving from the warm golds and reds of the childhood squares to the cool blues and greens of the university years. Clara's hand went to it immediately, touching the fabrics the way you touch things you half recognize. "Did you make this?" she said. "I did," I said. "There's something I need to tell you about it." "Theirs." And Brett, not maliciously, not cruelly, picked it up and held it out with both hands, examining it with the evaluative eye of a man assessing whether something matches the furniture. "Very rustic," he said, and there was a laugh in his voice that wasn't unkind exactly, just unthinking. "We're more of a minimalist household." He set it down on the gift pile. "Very sweet, Lorraine. Very old school." His sister Renata laughed. One of Clara's friends, the one who always laughs when she's uncomfortable, laughed. And that ripple went around the table, that gentle, obliging laugh of a room deciding who the powerful person is. Clara did not laugh. Clara looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And I looked at my daughter, who had my mother's eyes and my mother's stubbornness, and I said nothing. Because the pocket was still stitched shut, and Brett had not found it, and the laughter would keep without my help. I collected myself. I thanked Brett's mother for the dinner. I folded my quilt, the one he'd just appraised and dismissed, and I tucked it under my arm with the same steadiness my mother had always had, the steadiness I'd watched her use against 40 years of people who'd underestimated her quiet. I gave Clara a long hug and I said in her ear, "Call me later. There's something in the quilt I haven't told you about yet." She pulled back and looked at me. Something in my face made her go very still. "Mom." "Later," I said. "It's all right. Call me when you're home." I drove home through the dark in May, with the quilt on the passenger seat where Gerald used to sit, and I talked to him the way I do. "Well," I said, "he would have found that funny. He'd have been furious with himself for finding it funny. He'd have gotten up and said something, your father. He'd have been embarrassed for 2 days, and then he'd have made Brett a pot of chili and decided they were friends." I cried a little. Once I was in the driveway. Not a lot, enough to feel it. Because I had walked into that restaurant carrying my mother and my husband and 30 years of someone's quiet love, and I had watched it, called Rustic, and set aside. And the feeling of that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't felt it. It's not quite humiliation. It's more like watching something precious almost break without the person holding it ever noticing it was fragile. But underneath the feeling, by the time I was crying, something else had gone very calm. The pocket was still stitched, the bonds were still safe, and Brett had put the quilt down without turning it over, without feeling along the edge, without doing the one thing I'd been hoping someone would do. He'd never looked. Clara called at 11. She'd been home for an hour, she said. She'd needed time. I could tell from her voice that she'd been crying, the particular flatness of someone who has cried recently and not yet decided how they feel about it. "Mom," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Always, Frances called me. I closed my eyes. Frances, who can keep a secret like a bank vault, had apparently decided that tonight was not the night for bank vaults. She said, "You put something in the quilt." She said she saw you working on it, and you were. She said you were crying and you told her what you'd sewn inside. "Frances is a good woman," I said carefully. "She said there's money, Mum." She said Grandma Alice left. She said there might be quite a lot of money in that quilt. A long pause. "Is that true?" There are moments that are the whole point, that you've been building toward without knowing it. I had the quilt on my kitchen table. I put my hand on the backing, on the invisible seam where the pocket was. "Your grandmother saved for you," I said. "She started before you were born. Government of Canada savings bonds, bought a little at a time, for 30 years. She left them in her sewing basket for me to find, with a note that said to put them somewhere you'd have to look for them." The line was very quiet. "How much?" Clara said finally. Her voice had gone very small. $43,000, I said. "Give or take." I heard her breath go out. Not a gasp. More like the sound of something finally landing. "And there's a letter," I said. "In her handwriting. She sealed it herself. It says open when you're ready." Clara didn't say anything for a long time. I listened to her not saying anything. "Brett called it rustic," she said at last. "He did. He didn't know. He didn't look," I said gently. "That's the distinction that matters." Another long silence. Then, "Mom, what do you want to do?" "I want what your grandmother wanted," I said. "I want you to find it properly, in front of people who should understand what it is." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "Give me a few days." Brett called me himself the next morning. He'd been up since 5, he said. Clara had told him. He'd sat in the garage for most of the night, which is what Brett does when he doesn't know what to do with himself. He goes out to the garage and putters and thinks. He didn't try to explain himself. I respected that. He just said, "Lorraine, I don't know what to say to you. I'm not sure there's anything I could say." "No," I agreed. "Is it? Is the quilt still okay? Is everything still?" "The pocket is still sewn shut," I said. "Everything is exactly where I put it." I heard him exhale. "I'd like to fix this," he said, "whatever that means to you. I'd like to actually fix it, not just apologize and move on. Can you tell me what fixing it would look like?" And there it was. I hadn't expected that from Brett. I'd expected defense, or a version of events where he'd been surprised, or a polite and sincere apology that would settle nothing. The asking, the actual "what does fixing it look like," that surprised me. "Sunday dinner," I said. "My house, everyone who was there." I paused. Your mother, if she'll come. Frances, Clara's closest friend, and I'll open the pocket at the table the way your grandmother meant it to be opened. Properly. With everyone watching. Okay, he said. I'll make the calls. Brett, I said, before I could stop myself. Yeah, your grandmother-in-law spent 30 years saving for a child she loved more than she loved almost anything. She hid it in something handmade, because she wanted it to feel like it came from hands, not a bank. The money is significant. The letter is more significant. But what I need you to understand, before Sunday, before the dinner, just now, on the phone, is that none of that is the point. A pause. Then what is? The point, I said, is that you picked up something you'd never been taught to look at, and you decided in 3 seconds what it was worth, and you were wrong. And the next time you're in a room with something you don't immediately understand the value of, something old, something homemade, something quiet, I need you to stop for 1 more second before you decide. A long silence. Yes, he said. Okay, I hear you. They came on Sunday. I made pot roast because some things are just good weapons. Brett's mother drove up from her hotel. She'd extended her stay, I learned later, specifically for this, which told me more about her than she'd probably intended. Frances came early to help me set the table and stood in my kitchen with her arms folded and said, I'm not sorry, I told her. And I said, I know, Frances. I'm not sorry either. I'd laid the quilt in the center of the table, folded with the backing up, the invisible seam visible to no one but me. We ate first, I insisted. Brett was quiet, but present. His mother, whose name is Sandra and who has a way of filling a room without dominating it, asked me about the quilt fabrics over the soup course, genuinely curious, and I told her about my mother's yellow blouse and Gerald's flannel and Clara's first day of university dress. Sandra listened with an expression I hadn't expected from her, which was something close to moved. When the plates were cleared, I put my hand on the quilt. I'd like to give Clara her grandmother's gift, I said. Properly, the way Alice asked. The table went still. Clara's hands were folded in front of her. Brett was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something careful and open. His mother sat very straight. Brett, I said, you held this quilt 2 nights ago and you made a judgment about it. I'd like you to be the one to open it. I think that matters. He didn't hesitate. He reached across the table, took the quilt, and turned it over. I talked him through finding the seam, the invisible pocket, the tiny stitches. He found them by touch. His hands were careful. He used the little seam ripper I'd set beside the quilt, and he opened the pocket slowly, and he drew out what was inside. The bonds first. A thick bundle, rubber-banded, 30 years of patient deposits. He set them on the table and looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then the letter. A white envelope, sealed, in my mother's handwriting. Open when you're ready. These are Government of Canada savings bonds, I said. Your grandmother bought them, starting the year Clara was 3 years old. Every Christmas, every birthday, every good month for 30 years. They've all matured. I smoothed the table in front of me. They're worth $43,482. The number went around the table like a cold wind. Brett's mother pressed her hand to her mouth. Clara had gone very still, her eyes on the envelope. And this, I said, touching the letter gently, is the last thing your grandmother wrote to you, Clara. She sealed it herself. It says open when you're ready, and I have kept that instruction, so I'll leave it with you. I looked at my daughter. Then I looked at Brett. Your grandmother's exact words to me, I said, were, put them somewhere she'll have to look for them. Make her work for it a little. So I made a quilt. 7 months of evenings. Gerald's flannel in the 4th row. Your grandmother's blouse in the corner. Your first day of school curtains along the border. I paused. That's what was in your hands 2 nights ago, Brett. That's what you called rustic. I didn't say it to wound him. I said it because some things need to be said plainly, in good light, in front of people, because the saying of them is the whole point. Brett looked at the quilt. He looked at the bonds. He looked at the letter that Clara was holding now, with both hands, very carefully, not opening it yet. He put his elbows on the table, and he put his face in his hands for a moment, and he said nothing. Then he looked up, and what he said surprised me again. I'd like to say something, he said. If that's okay. No one moved. I have never in my life owned anything handmade, he said. Not one thing. Not growing up, not now. Everything in my house that has value has a brand on it and a warranty and a return policy. I have lived my entire life being taught that the measure of something is what it costs to replace it. He looked at me, and I walked into that dinner and I picked up something that had your mother and your husband and 30 years of someone else's love in it, and I made a joke about it in 15 seconds because I didn't know how to see it. I wasn't taught how to see it. A pause. That's not an excuse. It's just what's true. He picked up one of the savings bonds and looked at it. My father never saved for me like this, he said. Not quietly, not over 30 years. He was generous in a different way. Big gestures, good schools, but nothing you'd have to look for. Nothing sewn into something. He set the bond down. I didn't know people did that. The table was very quiet. Clara's grandmother did, I said, because she knew that the money would get spent. But the looking, the finding it, the knowing someone hid it for you on purpose, that lasts. That's the thing that outlasts the money. Brett nodded slowly. He didn't try to say more, which I appreciated. He'd said what mattered and he'd had the sense to stop there. What I decided came to me on the drive home from the restaurant 2 nights before, somewhere on the dark highway between the city and my apple tree and Gerald. I'd had a lot of time to think. About what my mother would have wanted. About what Frank always said. About how the wrong pair of hands can spend a legacy down to nothing before the paint is dry. I was not going to put $43,000 into an account with both their names on it. This is not because I distrust Brett. It's because I trust my mother's intentions more than I trust anyone's good intentions under financial pressure. Alice hadn't saved this for a couple. She'd saved it for her granddaughter. And the cleanest way to honor that is to make it clean. I told Clara what I'd decided. Not at the dinner table. I'd pulled her aside in the kitchen while the others were having coffee. I've spoken to someone at the credit union, I said. If you want, we can set up a registered account in your name only. The money goes in, it grows, it's yours, for whatever you need it, for that matters. A house, your research, something you build, your grandmother didn't specify. She just said something that lasts. Clara looked at me for a long moment. Brett won't be on it. No, he'll understand that. I think he's in a place to understand quite a lot right now, I said, but this was Alice's gift to you. It should be yours. She hugged me then without saying anything. The kind of hug that's also a thank you, and also an apology for things nobody needs to apologize for, and also just 2 women who have loved the same person. And are standing in a kitchen 30 years apart from each other, feeling the same thing. I'm going to tell you how it settled, because I know you want to know. The money went into a registered savings account in Clara's name. It sits there now, growing the way patient money grows, the way my mother knew it would. Clara calls it Alice's fund, and she hasn't touched it yet. She says she'll know when something is right for it. That sounds exactly like my mother, if I'm honest. The quilt is on Clara and Brett's bed. I know this because Clara sent me a photograph. It's laid across the foot. And it looks right there, the way things look when they've finally found their place. Brett chose where to put it, she told me. He moved the expensive linen throw to the closet himself and put the quilt there instead. He didn't say anything about it, he just did it. That told me more than an apology would have. Brett and I are different now. Not close in the easy way, probably not ever, but different. He asked me, about a month after the dinner, if I would teach him to identify fabrics by touch. He'd been thinking about his grandmother's old curtains, he said, wondering if they were salvageable, wondering if there was something to be made from them. We spent an afternoon in my sewing room with a pile of vintage fabrics, and I taught him the difference between cotton and linen and silk and wool, how to feel for the weight of something, how to hold it up to the light. He was a good student, very focused. He kept asking why. I told him why is the most important question. Most people never think to ask it about fabric. Sandra, his mother, sent me a card afterward, handwritten. She said, I raised my sons to succeed, and I'm not sure I taught them what that means. Thank you for the lesson. I put it in the wicker basket with my mother's sewing things. It seemed like the right place for it. Clara opened the letter on a Tuesday in June, sitting at my kitchen table, with a cup of tea she'd made herself, and the apple tree visible through the window, just finishing its last blooms. She didn't tell me everything it said. Some of it is only hers. But she sat there for a long time after, with the letter in her lap and her tea going cold, and then she looked up and said, "She knew I'd be a doctor. She says it in the letter. She wrote it when I was 3, and she already knew." "She knew you," I said. "She recognized you early." Clara folded the letter back into its envelope and held it for a moment. "I'm going to teach my kids to quilt," she said. "If I have kids, whenever that is, I want them to know how." "Your grandmother will be pleased," I said. "Yeah," she said. "I think she's already pleased. My hands are worse in the winter these days. The arthritis does what it does. But I'm making something new, a small piece, more manageable than a quilt. A wall hanging with a border of maple leaves because I've never made one and I think it's time. I'm putting something in it, though I haven't decided yet what. A story, probably. Hidden in the lining. Waiting. That's what we do, the women who make things. We put the important parts where they have to be found. We trust that the right person will eventually look. My mother taught me that, and I intend to pass it on. If this story reminded you of something your grandmother made with her hands, something you still have, something you wish you'd kept, drop it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be glad to have you. I'll see you next time.